Welcome back, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here with Emancipations Podcast. I'm very pleased to welcome Nathan Gorelick to the show. Nathan is a psychoanalytic Lacanian scholar of literature, as well as a whole range of very interesting subjects and topic areas that we both, in fact, share quite a lot of interest in. In fact, recently, Nathan and I shared a stage at Brown University to celebrate Joan Kopczak's new book, Cloud. Nathan is a student of Joan Kopczak and the former editor of the Umbra Journal, which, as we were saying at the Brown University event, may have been the most important Lacanian journal in the United States, perhaps ever produced, ever created, etc. But that's where he cut his teeth. Today, Nathan is in the English department at not Columbia, but you were at Utah Valley. Now right. You are at
Barnard College. Yeah.
Barnard. Big difference from Utah. You were teaching English in Utah, and now you are in New York. That must be very nice. You are also practicing psychoanalysis. You've gone through a very interesting and rigorous program in psychoanalytic training, because I know I bring on a lot of psychoanalysts to my show, and they then send me an email later and they say, hey, somebody listening to our discussion reached out to me for clinical work. So if you wish to reach out to Nathan, I wouldn't stop you. But Nathan's work also is interested in the Islamicate. He's written on Islamophobia and psychoanalytic theories of Islam, religion. So very broad, very compelling research project. I understand you're working on a project right now about the end of the world in literature. But today, I want to talk to Nathan. There's many things we can speak about, but I want to talk about the Unwritten Enlightenment, Literature Between Ideology and the Unconscious, your book with Northwestern, which came out in 2024. So it's still a new book, still a very fresh book. It's a study of 18th century literature, 3 novels, Robinson Crusoe, Tristram Shandy, and Rousseau, but Rousseau and de Sade. And I don't think there's like one novel you really focus on too much there. It's really, I really see that chapter as a comparison between Rousseau and de Sade. I learned in a lot. This is not my area of expertise. I've read about these authors. I've read many of the novels that I referenced here, but this is an extremely erudite project. Does this come out of your dissertation, this book?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Daniel, for that generous introduction. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. And the short answer to the question you just asked is, yes, this emerges out of my dissertation research, but the path from dissertation to book was a long and protracted one. As you noted, I spent a lot of time at Utah Valley University, which was an endlessly interesting and in many ways a very rewarding experience. Being back in New York after those years is a different sort of experience, and it's upon my return to New York that I was able to return to and reinvent the project and really sort of rewrite the whole thing from the bottom up. So while I was initially interested in my dissertation research in what the 18th century and the unconscious might have to do with one another, the critical apparatus that I attempt to construct here, and I think the ethical and political valences of the argument as I understand them really they stand on their own.
So I want to enter into the picture here by drawing out a distinction that we are pretty familiar with vis-a-vis Slavoj Žižek's work, but also Louis Althusser, and to some extent Lacan. And this is the distinction around ideology. And you make an argument that the novel plays a particular, or is sort of constrained. And I want you to talk about your wider theory of why the novel is interesting to you from the standpoint of ideology. What does the novel say about the limits of an ideological regime or an ideological discourse? And your focus here is, of course, on the 18th century novel. But you seem to you seem to suggest that the novel almost short circuits predominant ideology or dominant ideology. What does that mean, and what does the novel reveal? Because I think there's a sort of wider theory of the novel sort of as such that you're working with. Can you lay this out for us?
Yeah, you've really cut already to the heart of the argument from a literary, historical, and theoretical point of view. There's a lot more to be said about that, but to answer your first question as directly as I can, what does the novel say about the limits of an ideological regime? A study in the 18th century novel will, I think, very quickly reveal, and this is from reading novels themselves and from also reading the later history of the theory of the novel in the 20th and 21st centuries, that the novel is not just a kind of reflective literary, a domain of reflective literary experimentation that manifests some of the structural realities that are emerging throughout the 18th century. But it's really instrumental to the formation of those structures and those realities, the political, the social, and the, for lack of a better term, psychological realities that emerge at that time. Now, the 18th century seems to some of us like it might have been a long time ago, but it really remains the formative period for many or most of our contemporary political and social realities. So the invention of, well, not the invention, but the sedimentation of representative democracy, of bourgeois individualism, of liberalism and free market capitalism, and of the autonomous or sovereign individual whose rights and responsibilities stand at the center of all of this. These are all products of the 18th century. Now, when it comes to that individual and the individualism that organizes all of these social systems, structures, or small I ideologies, there really is no more powerful force behind the formation of that idea than the novel. The 18th century was the long period during which the novel rose to the kind of prominence or even the hegemony that it still entertains today in the literary marketplace. The sort of storytelling that the novel developed remains profoundly influential to cinematic storytelling, to serialized television storytelling today. And through all of this, the I, the individual at the heart of the narrative, is in a very real way welded inseparably to the world of representations to which that I belongs and that belongs to that individual. There are a couple of case histories I walk through with the novel, the most famous of which is Robinson Crusoe. There you've got one man alone on an island who invents his whole world out of his experience of that world. So what does the novel say about the limits of an ideological regime? First, it says that an ideological regime is a domain or a framework of representations, a way of understanding reality, what it is, and where I, or you and I, or we situate ourselves within it. The second thing that it does is, by way of the deployment of a kind of everyday language, the sort of language you would read in a newspaper, the sort of language you might encounter at a pub, and through the incorporation of everyday experiences of more or less mediocre, unexceptional individuals, no longer your Achilles or your Christian from Pilgrim's Progress, but your kid from the neighborhood. In all of these ways, it performs a remarkable naturalization of the constructedness of that field of representations, as though reality as we see it is the way it is because it is the way that it is, and it could not be any different. This is one definition that Zizek, for instance, gives of ideology, the spontaneous appearance of our reality as though it could not be otherwise. Another definition I use comes from Roland Barthes' Mythologies, in which he describes ideology, or he describes reality as the ideological abuse of what goes without saying. And that's a hyphenated phrase, what goes without saying. So this kind of multiple process of representation, naturalization, and then a kind of mystification of that whole process. So presenting all of these processes not as processes, but as given facts. That is, and it is not an exaggeration to say, an absolutely central invention of the novel, especially in the 18th century. So ideology as we know it today, or as Althusser will come to define it after the church falls away and education takes its place, is very much and literally a novel invention.
Thank you for that. Now, the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious, discovered, of course, in 1900 in the interpretation of dreams, you're reading back onto the 18th century. And your suggestion here is that we have to analyze the authors. And I want to sort of begin with Defoe and Crusoe, because I think you nicely point out that in a way, this is the most symptomatic text of the whole century, right? Insofar as it provides the rudiments or the sort of boundaries of individualism as we know it. Of course, we have the notion of the Robinsonade, and we have the idea that bourgeois society is somewhat paradoxically committed to atomized bourgeois individualism, even though bourgeois society is this like global market that's forcing sociality into a great connectivity. Right? So I've always seen the Robinsonade as a bit of a fantasy itself, a fantasy of isolation in an age which actually does not possess isolation at a subjective level. So what is the desire, if we could put it that way? What is the desire of Crusoe, if that makes sense, in the sense that you talk about even the author, right, comes from a bourgeois family and wishes to start fresh as a self-made man, right? There's an immediate class contradiction there, because if one comes from a well-to-do family, it's actually quite hard to start fresh. So I want to invite you there to maybe introduce the concept of the unconscious as you're analyzing it through this classic novel, perhaps, I don't know, the most classic novel. You begin the text in terms of your analysis with an analysis here of Crusoe. It seems so immense. So take that question as you wish, but I'm also sort of inviting you to sort of tee up how you're framing the Crusoe narrative as well.
Yeah, this actually recalls the second part of your previous question about how the 18th century novel maybe short circuits a dominant ideology. The first point to be made here is that the 18th century novels, if they can even be called novels, and that's another question that I foreground here, are subject to or at the heart of a longer history of reading that situates them ideologically as foundational to this larger project or idea, for better or worse, called the Enlightenment. And the first sentence in the book is, whatever else it may be, the Enlightenment is a myth. And Robinson Crusoe really represents the first major exercise of the mythologization of reason, the mythologization of an individual, or of individualism. If by that we mean two things. First of all, as I already described, the kind of naturalization of contingent cultural and historical formations, as if they could not be otherwise, ensconced in a kind of what goes without saying. And second, in a more structural sense, myths as frameworks of intelligibility within which we sort, we situate, and we come to understand the reality before us. So myths are not themselves real, but they are ways of organizing and understanding reality. And in this way, they become reified through the practices that they inform. So that's a general kind of theoretical overview of a response to your question. Now, as you say, Robinson Crusoe may be symptomatic of the whole 18th century. And I would submit it may be symptomatic of the whole of, let's put it in scare quotes, of modernity, to the extent that this is a hero's journey, which involves a typical bourgeois individual from a well-to-do family somewhere in northern England who, because of what he calls an impetuosity of desire and an I know not what, is compelled to break away from his family home, from his father's commandments, from his inheritance, from his birthright, and to strike out on his own in search of adventure, wealth, and I think ultimately in search of a good story. Now, the character Robinson Crusoe, what is his desire? It moves from being a mystery to, I think, quite clearly a desire for world domination, which frames itself as a calling or a vocation to world salvation in a very 17th, 18th century pseudo-Calvinist Protestant sense. So the novel presents itself not just as a kind of diverting narrative, but as a singular testimony of an experience of providential wisdom and of the possibility of world salvation, especially if one is able to exercise one's own private reason in service to the question, why am I here? Because that reason left alone, with the support, importantly, just of a Bible, but of no priests, will inevitably arrive at the conclusions Crusoe reaches on his lonely island. The question of bourgeois individualism and its relation to connectivity is important here as well, because Robinson Crusoe is a colonial narrative. The whole adventure on the island, which is the crux of the story and the core of its mythologization, of course, is the result of a failed slaving expedition, where Crusoe, after having successfully started a sugar plantation in Brazil, is compelled by some of the other planters there to return to West Africa to gather more enslaved labor to grow their plantation wealth. And it's on that trip that he is shipwrecked. So already slavery is the background and condition for the possibility of this story of heroic bourgeois individualism.
Primitive accumulation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well said.
Wow. Wow. We often neglect that. Yeah, we often neglect that. Now, one of the arguments you make here is you put the dialogue of Crusoe into discussion with Daniel Paul Schreber.
Mm-hmm.
Can you introduce who that figure is in the event that my listeners are not clear about Schreber? Schreber is also become a kind of cultural icon. Most famously, he's represented in Dark City, the 1999 film, which I absolutely adore. But he was a very famous psychotic that Freud analyzed, not in person, but in fact analyzed through reading Schreber's journals and diaries. So it's a very interesting. So Nathan, two questions. One is, explain Schreber. What gave you the idea to compare Daniel Paul Schreber to Defoe and to Crusoe? And what is the wider thesis you're making here apropos the madness of reason?
Yeah,
that's at work here.
Great. So let me say, first of all, and this returns again to the question that you asked a moment ago about reading the unconscious, which is a late 19th, early 20th century discovery, backwards into the 18th century. In fact, I conceive of the critical operation here somewhat differently. It is discovering the operations of the unconscious in the 18th century when it did not yet know its own name. And in doing so, also discovering the ways in which the early novel, the 18th century novel, established the cultural, historical, political, and even economic conditions for the possibility of the Freudian discovery more than a century later. So early in the Robinson Crusoe chapter, I make the argument that this story of a concerned mother, an angry father, and a wayward son who becomes the model of modern bourgeois individualism really is the origin of Oedipus, as Freud is describing it, as Freud is using it. Even though maybe Sophocles is a few thousand years earlier, Oedipus, Freud's Oedipus, is only possible because of Robinson Crusoe.
So pause here. Therefore, the Freudian analysis of Oedipus is a commentary on modern subjectivity, not some kind of trans-historical. That's, I think, essential.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that people read it that way, but perhaps maybe some do.
It's a common misreading, or maybe a bad faith misreading, but one that, and a lot of analysts themselves, I think, can be appropriately indicted for assuming that this is a kind of trans-historical, transcendental, universal model of subjectivity. And that's a danger that I think Freud himself hedged against constantly, but that sort of hedging does not prevent willful or accidental misreadings as you described. So I think it's an important point to underline. Now,
yeah, please continue.
Yeah. Now, okay, so the first point to be made is that Robinson Crusoe is, historically speaking, foundational to the total context within which the Freudian discovery will take place. And that means that rather than disrupting dominant ideologies intrinsically, the disruption of the ideology of Enlightenment individualism that Crusoe enables is an effect of its reading, of a reading which is kind of galvanized, energized, or organized by that discovery, that Freudian discovery, in an ex post facto or a kind of après coup manner. Now, what I discovered there, and this is pointing to your question about Schreber, is that I think Robinson Crusoe, as an emblem of the Enlightenment, as a total project, a set of colonial ambitions, a deeply racialized project, one that places, the white man at the center of every story. And this is not an identitarian claim, it's simply what the text says. As an emblem of all of that, Robinson Crusoe is also readable, I think eminently readable, as a psychotic text. Not in the sense that Crusoe was a kind of psychotic character, but that the entire narrative framework, the way in which the novel makes, as in invents sense out of this new world, is fundamentally a series of psychotic procedures. Now, in order to make that claim, I want to say, first of all, that psychosis from a psychoanalytic point of view is not some kind of pathology in need of containment or cure. It is a form of subjectivity, and one that, and Lacan emphasizes this over and over again, one that is in many ways more attuned to the difficulties, the impossibilities, the impasses of being human than any neurosis could ever hope to be. Because the psychotic lives on a visceral, on a physical, as well as a cognitive level. The immediacy of the experience of suffering a world that is entirely hostile to your being, which is what the world for any of us really is. It wasn't built with any of us in mind. It has no interest in the singularity of our own subjective desire. It only is interested in maintaining itself as it is and reducing us to useful cogs in service to that maintenance operation. So, Schreber, as you note, is probably the most famous psychotic in all of history. Even the diagnostic category of psychosis, which deserves to be problematized, is in many ways formed around this very famous text from the turn of the 20th century titled Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. I was so drawn to this text when I first read it many years ago in graduate school that I started with some of my grad school friends a rock band, and we called ourselves Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. We practiced every day for a month. We played exactly one show, and then I wouldn't say we broke up for creative differences, but it was, what can I say? It was madness. So Memoirs of My Nervous Illness is a remarkable book that anybody interested in psychoanalysis in any way, or even in the human condition in general, ought to give themselves the opportunity to read. And it's the only case of all of Freud's most important or most extensive case histories whose central character Freud himself never met. the so-called Rat Man, the Wolf Man, Dora, even little Hans, who he meets just briefly, but Schreber was present to Freud only as a text. And that already suggests a kind of profoundly linguistic dimension to psychosis as a diagnostic category and also as an experience. This is something that Lacan picks up on and runs with, at least for the entirety of Seminar 3. The wider thesis here is that by comparing the way in which Schreber builds his entirely hermetically contained, self-reproducing delusion is structurally homologous to the same operations for the construction of the new reality that Defoe imagines in Robinson Crusoe. Both Crusoe and Schreber, and Crusoe, by the way, is a sort of analog for the author Defoe here, and his adventure as a testimony is analogous to Defoe's own effort to proselytize his own Protestant faith. Both of them view themselves as exceptionally chosen to suffer in service to a kind of project of total world redemption. They view themselves as prophets of a coming salvation. They view themselves as directly linked through invisible threads. Schreber calls them divine rays. Crusoe calls them angelic voices to God or to providence. And through these divine rays, they are able directly, more than anybody else, to receive the truth and to act upon it. In fact, they are commanded to do so. And so I work through the various elements of the anatomy of a delusion as Schreber allows us to understand them. This is what Lacan calls the phenomenology of his language. And I show how step by step each one of those elements of that anatomy of a delusion is absolutely operative for the narrative structure, for the total organization of the novel Robinson Crusoe. And just to reiterate what I said a moment ago, as an emblem of the Enlightenment, it allows us to recognize the Enlightenment itself as a psychotic project. And to reiterate one more point here, that does not mean that the Enlightenment is somehow mad, and by seeing it as such, we therefore are sane. That would be to only reduplicate the same Enlightenment gesture of imagining that we contain the true reason that we can then subordinate all falsities to. But in fact, it just suggests that continuing to critique the Enlightenment with the same apparatuses of thought that the Enlightenment has given us will only result in this kind of recursive, reiterative reification of that same delusional structure. So we need other ways of addressing, of treating, of hearing, of responding to this delusion, which is, in fact, the entirety of our modern age.
So in the seminar on the psychoses, Jacques Lacan defines the psychotic as having foreclosed the primordial signifier, which kind of is at the rudiment of what he calls the symbolic. What I find interesting about this wider argument that the foundation of 18th century society is founded off of kind of islands of psychotic delusion, we could say, perhaps, right? Could I invite you to discuss the concept of the imaginary and how you are weaving that concept here together? Because I know at the end of your book, you invoke ideology and some of these debates that were kicked up after Althusser's intervention into the ISA essay, and then later Zizek's sublime object of ideology. You're not saying a kind of capitalism and schizophrenia argument that it's like psychosis all the way down, or you know what I mean? That like the social bond is psychotic, although it perhaps has a propensity towards that. So I want to invite you to describe that, the symbolic and the imaginary, perhaps, and then I want to invite you to talk about the concept of the social link as Lacan develops it. But first, if you, I try to, Nathan, be kind of I don't know, didactics may be the wrong word, but a little educative here. Could you explain some of these concepts for my listeners just to sort of get their bearings on this? And if that doesn't make sense, you can respond back to me.
I'll do my best. But I want to preface this by saying that I don't think anybody who claims to be an authority on what Lacan means is ever to be trusted. So what I can do is describe the imaginary, the symbolic, and perhaps also the real as I understand and as I am deploying them for the purposes of this argument. But that this, and I don't think any such pronouncement should be understood as a kind of encyclopedic pronouncement on things.
Why is that, by the way? Maybe that's something that people are frustrated by Lacanian psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I mean, people are frustrated by Lacanian psychoanalysis, I think, because psychoanalysis as such is, or in a normative sense, ought to be frustrating.
Yeah.
Right? If it isn't, then it's just another way of explaining stuff.
Yes, that's kind of links to the motif of the unwritten and this kind of movement of the kind of non-fixity of these forms. But with all of those provisos, perhaps you might now, because we don't, if you might explain how that works, because or give a little bit more meat on the bones apropos the concept of the psychotic subject and delusion in relationship to the imaginary and the symbolic.
Sure. To say briefly one more thing about the unwritten, one of the points I want to emphasize here is that by writing a book on the unwritten enlightenment, I don't propose, therefore, to cure it of its unwrittenness. What is unwritten in the enlightenment will remain unwritten, precisely because it is already there in what is written. It's on the other side of discourse. So we'll get back to that in just a minute. By way of, first of all, the imaginary. Now, as some of your listeners might already very well know, Lacan posits that there are three registers of subjective or lived experience: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. At its most basic, the imaginary names the world of appearances, the world of our sense perception, and the ways in which we locate ourselves within that domain of sense perception. This is why that early text of Lacan's on the mirror stage is so important. The mirror is important not only because by looking at myself in the mirror and recognizing myself, I differentiate myself from the rest of the world around me. Because before then, there is no sense of difference. But that also, in doing so, I address that image to the other. In Lacan's parable, it's the mother, who sits behind me and smiles, demonstrating to that smile a desire for the image that I am. Right? So my first experience of being in the world is being an object for another's desire. But that's all, of course, imaginary. What that smile means, what any other wants of me, is only something that I can imagine, that I have to, make up in my mind's eye. Though that's already slipping into a more colloquial definition of imagination, there is still a proximity there. The symbolic would name the ways in which I then locate myself in, or I am located within, a language. And language is not just the words I use to communicate my meaning to another person. It is a whole social and historical context. It contains its own philosophies, its own assumptions, in some cases, its own metaphysics, its own limitations. And anybody who has attempted to translate from one language to another, even one very proximate language, like say from Italian into Spanish, will know that something is always inevitably lost in translation, because languages both enable what we can say and limit at the same time what what we can say, what we can express, and in many ways, what we can even think. So languages are bigger than any of us. And yet each of us has to find a way to position ourselves within this vast apparatus by which a collective makes sense of the world. So that primordial signifier you described early in his teachings in Seminar 3, Lacan refers to this famously as the name of the Father. Think of it, as sort of your last name. This isn't an ideologically prescriptive point Lacan is making. It's a descriptive point. At this moment in time in our culture, in our civilization, or at least, in France in the mid-1950s, a child receives their first name, which is the name of the person they see in the mirror, and they receive their father's last name, which does not mean anything except the possibility of being made meaningful. All that it does is it locates you, Lacan says, in a broader symbolic chain. So it has no meaning of itself, but without it, we would be sort of free floating in language. Now, this dovetails with your last question about the social link. Language, whatever else it is the structure of the social link. The social link is not something that sort of exists in some floating transcendental realm that comes down and grabs us here and there. It is something that, again, at the level of subjective lived experience is specific to all of us, but that we are variously compelled to negotiate among others. So the social link is operative right now between you and me. It is, in a more attenuated sense, operative between me and a stranger on the subway. It is probably not particularly operative between me and somebody whom I have never met 10,000 miles away and never will. Not to say that there aren't ramifications to our experiences that will affect one another, but the social link has to do, as with everything, I think, in Lacan, with subjective lived experience. When people want to read Lacan as a kind of philosophical authority on any subject, I think they miss, and this is one of the reasons why Lacan could be so frustrating, that he's not making these grand metaphysical meta-narrative or meta-linguistic pronouncements. He's trying to get at what a strange and ineffable experience it is to be alive and to have to be alive with others. Now, the last part of an answer to your question has to do with what throughout the book I oppose to ideology, and that's what I call, with Lacan, with Freud, what I call fantasy. So fantasy is, and this is what another one of my teachers, Willie Apollon, calls it. He says it is the window of the unconscious into the imaginary. So fantasy is the domain of my subjective experience of desire, where I aim for some object, some impossible object of satisfaction. Why is it impossible? Because it's phantasmatic, because it only exists as fantasy. And that I will look for, particularly in the imaginary. I will see another person. I will say, I love you. You are my object. At some point, that person will reveal themselves to be an actual human being, and I will experience disillusion and disappointment because of that. Because fantasy, whether it's in relation to a person, to a project, to a politics, will ensure that reality as we know it is always disappointing, but it is never what it promises to be, or what we expect it to be, or what we desperately need or demand that it be for us.
So the novel then is a window into fantasy and delusion that offers us a way of a kind of juxtaposition to understanding the context of dominant ideologies that situate or contextualize the novel itself. So this idea of kind of historicizing the novel is very important to you, and I think is essential. And you say at one point that the novel's subject of address is the critic, which I found to be very interesting because it's not the lay reader, it's the critic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to to actually ask you about that as a point of clarification, because you're trying to draw out a way of reading the novel akin to the relationship between analyst and analysand in the psychoanalytic context of the talking cure. Can you explain that concept that you introduce? And before you do that, would you also, even though we recognize that these definitions are always moving and not fixed, could you define the real in the Lacanian sense? But yeah, so those two things, and then I want to move on to Rousseau and the Marquis de Sade.
So the urge or the request to define the real is as good a definition of the real as one could hope for. But kidding aside, I would suggest that the real is everything else that cannot be sorted or situated in the symbolic or the imaginary. The symbolic is, profoundly historically contingent. The imaginary is simply the realm of appearances. The real is the vast, irreducible remainder of what it means to be that cannot be so easily contained within those two other categories. The real, I love a definition of reality by Philip K. Dick that sounds a lot like Lacan's definition of the real. He says something like, reality is that which doesn't go away just because you stop believing in it.
That's right. That's very helpful. I think this is very useful for folks that are kind of coming at Lacanian psychoanalysis anew. I mean, I think all of us come at Lacanian psychoanalysis with a freshness, because I think the gravity of the conceptual armature that Lacan develops is so immense that I always like to think of it kind of like Zen mind, beginner's mind. Every time you read Lacan, you kind of come at it like, okay, I'm a baby now. I'm coming at it fresh. So there's a little bit of that, I think, that can be useful, kind of cleaning of the slate, as it were. But yeah, could you also discuss a little bit about this mode of address of the novel? Where do you get this idea? Because I have the sense that's like, once we get to the 19th century and you have like the real expansion of the serialized novel, and realism starts to really come into the picture, is not the novel a very masses oriented phenomenon, whereby is the novelist really writing for the critic? Are they not writing for the common man, the everyday person, the reader, the non-specialist? Or perhaps this is the 18th century. So does that make sense? Like, how do you understand that?
Oh, yeah. Well, let me answer this question in reverse. First of all, yeah, absolutely. The novel is written to be read. The strategies of representation that it develops, that I already described, an emphasis on verisimilar description, on realism, on plain language. Not to say that every novel is like this. If you read, I don't know, if Finnegan's Wake is a novel, it's clearly not this kind of a novel. But Robinson Crusoe certainly was. The other, let's call it a novel that I read from the 18th century English tradition, Tristram Shandy, was an international bestseller, and the author Laurence Sterne was sort of the most famous celebrity of his moment because of that novel. And that was deliberately, it wasn't an accident. He intentionally cultivated his celebrity in his writing in order to do so. So yes, the novel has long been masses oriented. So what then to make of this notion that literature is addressed to its critic? Now, that's an important distinction, to say that literature constitutes a certain specific structure of address whose addressee is its critic raises the secondary question of whether and to what extent a novel then is literature. Are all novels literature? Is literature, or is the literariness of any text contingent on the strategies of reading that animate it? I would say the answer to the second question for me is probably yes. Now, the question of the analogy between analyst and analysand, I think, is helpful here as well. As I sat down to rethink my approach to this whole project, I had to ask myself, just what, if anything, literature and psychoanalysis have to do with one another? I mean, seriously. There is a long history in the humanities from around the 1930s or earlier, all the way up to the present, of reading Freud in English and comparative literature departments. And of course, there's a long history in psychoanalysis of reading literature, whether it's Oedipus or Hamlet or Don Quixote or Robinson Crusoe, and so on and so on. But to what extent are either of these fields really dealing fundamentally with the other? And to what extent are they rather using these others as instruments with which to demonstrate their own expertise or prestige, or again, opportunities simply to explain? And I think in large part, that is what literature has been for psychoanalysis. When you read what Freud is doing with Oedipus or with Hamlet, he's not engaging in some critical literary commentary about questions of form and historicity. He's using literature to illustrate clinical insights in order to generalize those insights and to enable some kind of inheritance of psychoanalytic knowledge or praxis, such as it is, beyond the radical specificities of any one clinical encounter.
And the literary absolute is another concept that I invite you just to sort of insert into this wider tableau that you've been developing here, just so we're clear with it, because I think it's an important one for you.
Mm-hmm.
Is the author of this concept, or the originator, is it Jean-Luc Nancy? Or is
it was Nancy and Philippe Le Coulabart.
Yeah. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Why is this an important concept for you, and what does it signify?
Right. So this helps get to this analogy that I'm drawing. So the answer to this problem, as I attempt to articulate it, is that literature and psychoanalysis are really quite different. But an analogy can be drawn between them if we keep in mind that analogies aren't about collapsing differences into similarities or identities, but about recognizing the simultaneity of identity and difference between two things. So the emphasis on the difference between the two of them is what enables the possibility of a relation between them. The literary absolute is the pivot that I use in order to draw this analogy from the side of literature and reading and criticism as I'm defining it. Now, there are a few different histories of criticism and the critical tradition. We, in a colloquial sense, think about literary criticism as the sort of stuff you read in the New York Times Sunday magazine. The question, how many stars does this novel get? Is it any good? Like the Roger Ebert film criticism, but for books. Judgments as to the quality, however a critic wants to define that quality, of a given work. But literary criticism, as someone like Philippe Le Coulabart and Jean-Luc Nancy will define it, or since you brought up historicizing, as somebody like Frederick Jameson will define it, or even earlier as this formerly upstart gang of academics who called themselves the new critics would define it earlier in the 20th century, is not about passing summary judgment on the quality of a work, but rather about articulating the internal logic of a piece according to what cannot be translated from that piece or from that internal logic into some other discourse, some other idiom. Okay, so the new critics were poets and they were critics of poetry. And so they wanted to see, what, after we situate a poem within its history, what remains of the poem as poetry that can't be paraphrased into, for instance, prose. If I say, what does this poem mean? And I'm decoding it prosaically, I am perforce subtracting it of its poetic quality.
So this is the way to understand the inflection of absolute. It's not how we would intuitively think of absolute. It's like more like a negation of the absolute as that remainder of what's singular after you've performed this type of analysis on the text.
Yeah, and so and the book, The Literary Absolute by Le Coulibart and Nancy, says actually this experience of reading whereby the reader enters into a kind of singular and reflective experience with the text, so that criticism and creation cease to be diametrical opposites and become two mutually reinforcing elements of the same relationship. That was invented at the end of the 18th century by the early German romantics in Jena, people like Friedrich and August Wilhelm Schlegel, like Novalis. And it was there that these folks first announced that literature is, by definition, something other than the history of a text, something other than the reception of a text, something other than the economic and material conditions for the production of the text. Literature is made by that reflective, critical, creative relationship.
And this goes back to the point of the addressee being the critic.
Right.
And so, in that sense, you could define the critic in a quite egalitarian way. It's not the critic as the specialist, it's the critic as in every reader is a critic.
To the extent that they enter into this way of reading with the text that isn't simply about cultivating my own personal impression of what it means. To the extent that I am not attempting to decode the text as though it is some secreted message being sent from an author, alive or beyond the grave. To the extent that I am interested in elucidating what is already there in the text, but which cannot appear as it does before I bring my interaction to it.
Right, which means that, yes, people need education in reading in order to become a critic. And this brings us to Rousseau and the chapter on Rousseau, which is about education. Talk about the scandal of Rousseau's publication of Emile, which was a very interesting moment, I suppose, where Jean-Jacques Rousseau goes into hiding and is all around Europe, kind of fleeing the authorities. You talk about how, well, sure, Rousseau becomes the emblem later in the French Revolution of the Jacobins, but perhaps this is not like the best way to read Rousseau, as like he didn't come out the gates, as it were, as a great kind of pre-socialist universalist. Because I want your sense of Rousseau, because of course we always read Rousseau as conditioned or kind of colored by the revolutionary tradition. That's not exactly the way you're reading him here, which is fine. So perhaps we might start with your reading of Rousseau and describing the fact that Rousseau's contribution, in a sense, is highly untimely, in the sense that it is not as Sterne. He does not experience some fame, or no, he becomes infamous and he becomes a criminal. Why does this happen? And what is so scandalous about Rousseau's text?
There are a lot of ways of answering this question of Rousseau's notorious iconoclasm. And I would just point out that it is in part because of the unkind reception he receives after the Emile that he becomes the posthumous firebrand for the revolutionaries starting around 1791. From the beginning, Rousseau was an upstart and a provocateur. Before the Emile, which is his long pseudo-philosophical, pseudo-fictional, narrativized treatise on an ideal education.
Why do you say pseudo?
Because it's not quite a philosophical excursus the way you might expect other treatises and essays of the time to appear. If you read Locke or Montesquieu or any of these other contemporaries, it's a very different stylistically experimental approach to doing philosophy. And it's the construction of a central character, a child named Emile, from before birth all the way to the moment at which they will assume the position of the tutor that the author, teacher, father, Rousseau had been occupying up to that point. So it is also the prototype of the Bildungsroman. And that's a matter of historical.
And there's a connection to Crusoe insofar as there's this same cutting or subtraction of it's an origin story. It may not be a hero's story, but it's also something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something related there.
It's more than related. There's a moment. So the way that Emile is structured.
Oh, right. There's a literal. No. I know what you're going to say. Go ahead. Go ahead.
There's the way that Rousseau is that the Emile is structured is that every chunk of the book enters into a different phase in the development of this young person. So the first pages are addressed to the mother while Emile is still in the womb. And then we get to how do you deal with infants? Rousseau's got some very interesting ideas, like you should never wrap them up in swaddling clothes because babies want to flop around and you're restricting their natural freedom. He says if a baby screams, you should not respond to that screaming because that is conditioning them to recognize the value of tyranny and so on. So he's got his own singular approaches to things. The idiosyncrasies are not so important though. So when he gets to Emile's teenage years, around the year 14 or 15, the first onset of the passions, he describes them, which, in a kind of organicist sense today, our culture or civilization would likely dismiss as like hormones in teenagers. He says, until that time, Emile is not allowed to read a single book. Books are bad for him. He's going to learn how to play around, how to flop around in a field, and he's going to learn trades. He's going to learn how to use his hands. He's going to learn how to be a blacksmith or whatever. Finally, though, I'll give him his book, his only book, the only book he will be allowed for his entire upbringing, and that book is Robinson Crusoe.
Of course. Amazing.
Yeah. So, just a terrific, more than coincidence there. Parenthetically, I should say that somewhere Willie Apollon has written that Rousseau also was psychotic. Usually many of the people who change the world for better or worse are.
And again, when you say that, it's kind of hard for people maybe unfamiliar with this idea. It's not to say that he's mentally ill or that he's prone, that his psyche is structured along the psychotic structure. Is that rare? Maybe just to sort of orientate people here, is that sort of like, I know I was speaking to Ellie Ragland, rest in peace, and she's one of the foremost experts actually on hysteria, not psychosis. She's expert on hysteria, has a forthcoming posthumous book on hysteria, by the way. She's been on my show. Mm-hmm. But she was saying that, psychotics are born this way. Is that true? Or out of curiosity, as a total side point? Or I know that's a hard question to answer, Nathan, but I'm just curious, like how people can understand the structure of psychosis.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the question that the phrase born this way implies some kind of genetic determinism that I'm not entirely comfortable with, in part because I think it's pure speculation. I think what psychoanalysis offers by way of one of the operative theoretical concepts that I use throughout the book, this notion of construction, is that it may be possible from our own moment to build a kind of narrative of an origin, which is not a description of a true origin, but a way of organizing and understanding the relations among the elements of our contemporary reality that make it what it is. So, whether one is born a psychotic or is made one is an interesting question, one that I don't think I can answer. But I would also suggest that psychosis is specific to the social and historical circumstances within which one finds oneself. In one culture or civilization, what in our culture might be recognized as psychosis might be differently recognized as some other form of eccentricity. So I'd be wary of kind of universalizing these
Sure.
diagnostic categories as
And I
well.
know they're very much in contention. I mean, when you listen to psychoanalysts read cases to each other, they often debate about these structures and whether a particular patient or analyst hand falls into one structure or the other. It's a bit complex, but nonetheless, to return to Rousseau, why was this text so scandalous in the social context in which it was released?
So you can already imagine, based on the little bit that I've told you, that the contentiousness of some of his pronouncements is directed explicitly and quite provocatively at a number of the norms of the time when it came to child rearing, when it came to the idea of how to make a person into some kind of a citizen. It's also a continuation, and this was the point I was getting at a moment ago. It's a continuation of his larger project of subverting, undermining, vituperatively criticizing the norms and assumptions of his own moment. So he first made his big splash into the intellectual scene in France with his so-called first discourse. He's perhaps more widely read for his second discourse, the discourse on the origins of inequality. But the first discourse on the sciences, shorter, and in my personal opinion, more explosive, is a response to a question posed by the Academy at Dijon, which every year would hold an essay contest. A lot of people we think of now as famous philosophers, they made their livings writing for and winning essay contests. Immanuel Kant is probably the most well-known among them. So the Academy at Dijon had the most prestigious, the most well-known and widely publicized of these contests. And they asked the question, somewhere in the 1740s, whether our advancements in the arts and sciences had led to moral improvement. And of the many dozens, perhaps hundreds of submissions they received, only 2 of them answered no. One of them apparently wasn't very good and is basically forgotten to time, and the other one was Rousseau, and he won. And so from the beginning, he argued that civilization is a kind of degeneration, that every so-called advance we make in the progress of our idea of humanity is a step away from that humanity. Every step into civility is a step into, and this is an anachronism, into repression, into alienation, and pulls us further and further from our natures. And so we would do well to begin to imagine how to reinvent, if it's possible, to reinvent our social order on the pattern of nature rather than at its expense. And what Rousseau says nature is not what, the aristocracy, the police, the clergy in France want nature to be. It's a kind of a profound and powerful delegitimizing of that rigidified, hierarchical, and repressive situation. It's a kind of extreme egalitarianism. And it's an indictment of morality as the worst kind of immorality.
So to follow the story, he basically becomes like a recluse, a political sort of most wanted figure. And in a way, what I find interesting here, and I think this is, I mean, you spend a little bit of time on this, but I'm just sort of out of curiosity, because I'm asking for my own. In your research on Rousseau, did you get the sense that his own commitment to the consequences of the egalitarianism that he is implying in these works, is there a kind of strong political conviction here? Like, what if Rousseau is to be read similar to Defoe as a kind of psychotic, what does that say about the radical egalitarian project that he becomes the inspiration for? That's my question. Like, what's the unwritten symptomatic element there? Because this intersects, just as a totally selfish point, this intersects with my own desire insofar as, I situate myself in line with Rousseau. I mean, I identify with him very strongly, and I think many of us do. So you're kind of inviting us to sort of maybe think differently about that identification. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say Rousseau's a complicated figure, and identification is a complicated problem, right? So identification implies an opportunity or a desire to see something of oneself in another, and to respond to that seeming recognition by building oneself in the direction of that image, by aspiring to the identity that you somehow recognize in another. So there is something, I think, exciting and aspirational about Rousseau's, sort of punk rock attitude in a certain sense.
Right. Because you're also reading him in a way that a lot of people don't read him, as in fact a strong critic of the progressive movement, right? So that's very interesting. And I think perhaps part of this conversation is undone because we haven't introduced the other interlocutor, which you have pieced together to read Rousseau, which I suppose you see as essential to read Rousseau, which is, of course, the Marquis de Sade. They are very interesting figures to read together. I think in a way, they both have, perhaps we could introduce de Sade vis-a-vis the French Revolution narrative itself, insofar as some have read the Marquis de Sade as attempting a type of scission on what the French Revolution did not achieve, because they're not exactly contemporaries. De Sade is sort of a participant, a witness to the revolutionary movement, whereas Rousseau is like the godfather inspiration of it. And like Adorno and Horkheimer see de Sade as saying a very perverse truth to the Jacobins, which is that you're trying to do year zero. You're trying to destroy the edifice of Christianity and all of its semblance in society, but you have not gone far enough. And my philosophy will permit us to go farther in a certain way. So they tend to read him a la Nietzsche as a kind of prophet of realizing the suffocating hold that Christianity has over social life. You're not exactly reading him that way. Can you introduce how you are, in fact, reading? Because you're reading them, you're reading Rousseau and de Sade vis-a-vis the concept of nature in a very interesting way. So could you introduce the Marquis de Sade into the mix here?
Yeah. So I really think that Sade's philosophy, such as it is the unwritten element of Rousseau, to the extent that Sade, in his own mind, is drawing Rousseau to his logical conclusion. Now, at one point in this reading of the two of them, I refer to Rousseau's whole project as a kind of revolutionary conservatism. And in fact, the revolutionaries who take them up, I don't think would, to use an already loaded term, identify with what we recognize today as a kind of progressivism after, say, Marx, or other sort of alternatives to the bourgeois model. What they would argue is that, and they didn't even use the word revolution, not until sort of after the fact. What they would argue is that they are attempting a restoration of the world as it should be after its long history of corruption and degeneration at the hands of an unjust and unnatural social order. So when Rousseau says nature goes like this, the revolutionaries take that up to say, well, then we need to get back to nature. And that will involve, by necessity, tearing down all of the artifice that that's sort of clogged it up in the meantime. Now, this is not an idea that Rousseau invented. Much earlier, someone like Thomas Hobbes established what we would now call political science, maybe following someone like Machiavelli, who was interested in a kind of value neutral attempt to simply describe how politics works, take it or leave it. Hobbes follows in Machiavelli's footsteps by inventing this idea of the state of nature in order to be able to imagine, via a kind of necessary philosophical fiction, a kind of hypothesis, what human beings are really like in our natures, so that we can then build an ideal state apparatus in response to that nature. For Hobbes, nature has to be repressed because it's violent, it's self-interested, it's atomistic, it's inherently dangerous, it is uncivil. Rousseau's version of the state of nature flips Hobbes on its head, right? So it's the same sort of necessary philosophical fiction, but he gets rid of solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short in Hobbes, and describes the state of nature instead as a kind of, hanging around under the trees, playing the guitar, eating apples all day, until civilization comes along and kind of corrupts our natures and sends us on this horrible adventure.
Right, because here we'd have to introduce the Lacanian conception of jouissance, insofar as both Rousseau and de Sade think this form of excessive enjoyment that Lacan famously defines as jouissance, and I want you to explain that, but I have the sense that Rousseau is somehow deficient in his conception here of the antagonism that is intrinsic to pleasure and enjoyment. He doesn't, he thinks it in a rather naive way, and I think the consensus on Rousseau and that I think is pretty well established, that people know that there's a kind of paradox at the heart of Rousseau's thought. Perhaps we could call it a kind of naivete. And I think you did a nice job invoking Hobbes as there. But introduce this concept of jouissance for us, and how Rousseau and de Sade are thinking it.
Yeah. So, why is it, this is one of the animating questions of psychoanalysis, why is it that we keep returning to that which hurts us? Why is it that we seek what destroys us? How is it that we enjoy what we take no pleasure in. Jouissance is at its simplest an enjoyment that is not pleasurable, a kind of an excess that takes us, in Freud's language, beyond the pleasure principle.
Mm-hmm.
And in that book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud announces what is by far his most speculative formation or discovery, namely the death drive. Now, the death drive is not the same as a drive to destruction. It is a drive that pushes us past the relief that pleasure provides for us.
Mm.
So an enjoyment that is tormenting, that is torturous, an enjoyment that is painful, that's what's at stake in jouissance, and that's what's at stake in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is also not, therefore, an attempt to corral jouissance with pleasure, to make our lives more enjoyable, to help us adjust ourselves to the difficulties of our circumstances, but rather an opportunity, perhaps, to activate that painful enjoyment as an indication of how the world around us and what we are investing in isn't really what we want, isn't bringing us any joy, is not enabling us to create anything new, to make anything of ourselves in the world. So we have to follow that torment in order to get out of the traps that we've set for ourselves and that our society and civilization wants to set for us. The signifier of nature is very important here because, as I was already indicating, nature with a kind of capital N in the 18th century, under the heading of what we now call problematically the Enlightenment, replaces God as the kind of master signifier. So whatever nature is, it becomes this profoundly contested term because whoever wins that contest gets to win the ideal image of what our society ought to look like. Is it a Rousseauistic? Is it a Hobbesian? Is it a Lacanian sort of nature? What is nature? Now, the Marquis de Sade says, hold on a second, Jean-Jacques, and he refers to him by first name because he loves Rousseau. He's a tremendous fan of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He says, wait a minute, what is nature? Nature, I mean, go outside. It's terrible out there. There's a famous quote that floats around from Werner Herzog from his film about Klaus Kinski, My Best Fiend, in which he's describing what, for him, the jungle is, as opposed to Kinski, who sees the jungle as beauty and creation and life. Herzog says something like, all I see is, death and fornication. It's just this very kind of jagged, terrifying, valueless abyss of things eating things. And that's more akin to what Sade sees nature as. But, he says, that is not a reason to run away from nature or to suppress it, as the Hobbesian position might be. But following Rousseau, following the imperative to reinvent ourselves according to the pattern of nature, that means that we need to imagine a society which is equally violent, cruel, and indifferent, which is obsessed with the kind of the chaotic purposelessness of living and dying. And the best we can do under these circumstances is learn to love it, to be like nature, to indulge as much as we can and beyond what we're capable of in this sort of twinned experiences of violence and sexuality. And that's a sort of shocking and surprising discovery to make in Rousseau. That's the discovery I think Sade is asking us to arrive at.
So for the Marquis de Sade, he tries to insert himself in the Republican tradition coming out of the French Revolution by introducing what Enlightenment philosophy was too petrified to introduce into the wider kind of maxims of reason, because of course he famously reads Kant's Critique of Pure Reason while he's imprisoned, which I find very interesting and funny. And of course, Lacan wrote a very important text called Kant with Sade, and this is an important text for you as well. So the Marquis de Sade has a lot to teach us. But how does one understand the lesson of the de Sade? Because in a sense, it's always obviously a very, especially in our day and age, it's kind of hard to contextualize how one learns from de Sade.
Yeah.
What does Lacan say about that, insofar as he makes this point that de Sade is more true to Kant's ethics than Kant himself? Because of course Kant's ethics tries to push to the side all of these empirical desirous blemishes from his system of thinking, and the de Sade creates an ethics where they're all at the front and center of things. And that moreover, he says this is the only way to eradicate the vestiges of this repressive, because I think the critique of Christianity, especially if you read, what is it, Onward Frenchman, that little manifesto that they saw writes.
Once more, or encore.
Once more, dear Frenchmen, something like this.
If you would be Republicans, yeah.
If you would be Republicans, right? So this, who is this guy? It's such a strange voice from the wilderness, kind of making this intervention. How do you, because people kind of categorize him in all of these different ways. Is he a kind of eccentric libertine? Could he rather be seen as a kind of truly corrective political theorist to the Republican tradition? It's quite hard to take him seriously when you read Philosophy in the Bedroom and you read these kind of scenarios. Everyone should read de Sade. I think it's important because a lot of people read de Sade through Lacan. I would say go back to the source and just get a feel for it. It's hilarious. It's crazy stuff, in fact. And it's actually more contemporary now because we live in a pornographic age today. So it hits differently in the same way that like neoliberalism, when you teach undergrads Hobbes, they understand Hobbes because we live Hobbes. So I don't know, take that as you wish, but like, I guess my question is sort of, how do you learn from the Marquis de Sade, and how do you, what is his importance here?
Yeah. Well, let me just briefly say that the more you read Sade, the less impressed you are by the seemingly pornographic dimensions of his writing. That's really the least interesting and the most kind of banal and tedious part of the writing. And in fact, Sade will sometimes go well beyond what is permitted or possible or even thinkable within the domains of pornography. And there's something about that capacity for excess that continues to fascinate. And that's a big reason why he enjoyed such a resurgence of critical interest in the middle of the 20th century. I would echo your suggestion to read Sade, but maybe not too much. Some of the, throughout the chapter in the book, I cite a number of important and formative critics in the sense that we've been describing criticism before, who are fabulous readers of Sade as a literary figure. And there's a great deal in there that gets missed otherwise if you just treat him as a kind of ersatz political philosopher. And part of the argument that I make also is that because that weird Republican tract, once more, Frenchmen, if you would be Republicans, kind of falls out of the middle of Philosophy in the Bedroom. That's in the plot of Philosophy in the Bedroom itself. It cannot simply be excised as some kind of, true political speech on Sade's part, but has to be situated within this orgiastic pyramid of violent excess that characterizes the rest of the dissertation and demonstration of the characters in the book. So it has to be understood within that context. Otherwise, it will inevitably be completely misread. What do we get from Sade by way of Lacan. And this is another reason why I think it's important to return to Rousseau here, because what Rousseau is doing is inventing what will become, what will have been, the authoritative text on enlightened subject formation. So Sade's saying, aha, but what's really going on there, and drawing it to its logical conclusion. It's important historically, it's important critically, and I think it's important ethically. Lacan does something similar, but of course with Kant. And there he says, among many other things, that what Kant fails to acknowledge, or what in fact he spends a great deal of energy actively disavowing, is the degree to which reason itself, pure practical reason, the moral law, is motivated by a kind of desire. A desire for freedom from nature, a desire for freedom from the pathological, from the empirical, a desire to be sanitized of the world. So there is something more radical than the law for Lacan, and that is desire itself. Now, as far as what Sade teaches us about Rousseau, and this maybe will get us back to Kant in just a moment, is already there in Lacan's rereading of what he calls the Sadean maxim. Now, as those of your listeners who have or maybe have not yet read Sade might assume, the Sadean maxim is often articulated within that vast 20th century history of the resurgence of interest in Sade as something like, I have an absolute right to enjoy you to the extent of my desires, and you can't do a thing about it, and I don't care whether you want it or not. What Lacan very subtly but profoundly introduces into that maxim is this little phrase. He says, I can do anything I want with you or with your body. Anybody can say to me without there being any limit, et cetera, et cetera. And that bizarre dislocation of the position of the address suggests that what nature really wants, if we're going to follow Sade, following Rousseau, is not for us to enjoy without limit, but for us to be enjoyed. To be enjoyed by the other, by an other, by any other, without limit. And that is a more terrifying and more profound egalitarianism than anything that the Republicans or Rousseau could have imagined. But, and I can't, repeat the entire arc of the argument. In the book, I sort of show through a formalism of Emile alongside philosophy in the bedroom, how this logic is already there in Rousseau. This, because all that the author / father / teacher Rousseau is doing, according to his own argument, is following nature's will in designing a child the way that he is. So he is himself only being instrumentalized in service to some other greater desire than himself.
Does this go back to a kind of imminent problem that perhaps Sade recognizes in Jean-Jacques as as unified with nature with a capital N, and that Rousseau therefore cannot get around the fact of his own pedagogical origin as the father in his wider theory of pedagogy, and that Sade is trying to thinks that he's found a way out of that suffocating loop, if you will.
Yeah.
Right.
Emile becomes foundational to modern child-centered education.
Right.
Like the whole Montessori movement is inspired by Rousseau. The whole kindergarten movement is inspired by Rousseau. It's not until around the 70s or 80s that people, actually John Dewey earlier in the 20th century discovered this as well, that Rousseau's vision is profoundly authoritarian.
Right.
He wants to absolutely erase the child's will altogether so that the child will become a perfect replica of himself.
Right.
And so that commitment to being a father in service to this despotic, irresistible force called nature, that's exactly what Sade is.
It's kind of like a libertarian paternalism, but Sade is trying to get rid of the paternal.
Yeah, Sade says, look, if we follow your logic to its own conclusion, we ought to arrive not at the infinite replicability of your authority on into a perpetual future, but we will encounter your own absolute annihilation.
That's amazing. Wow. Of course, de Sade is buried, insistent on being buried in nature with an unmarked grave, with no signifier to contain his body, so that he has a true immersion into nature. So perhaps in the battle over who can claim nature, de Sade, in that sense, wins insofar as de Sade sees the tyranny of the signifier and has found a way to go beyond it. In the third text, which is very important to you, in fact, so important that you have a tattoo of it.
I do.
Well, we can see part of it. We can see it's very hard to show. There it is. You'll have to explain this to us. Is Tristram Shandy? Tell us about this novel. It's a book that I have not read, but after reading your synopsis and your analysis and so on of it, I'm extremely motivated to read it. I could summarize it, but let me invite you to do so, especially given how important and dear this text is. Maybe I could ask you, Nathan, like, why is it so singular for you? And then we'll get to how you situate it in this wider, the Unwritten Enlightenment. What do you love about it so much?
Yeah, that's a more elaborate way of asking a question that I often receive before I've had my coffee in the morning, when I'm like at the cafe and the cashier notices the tattoo and says, "Hey, well, what's your tattoo about?" And I'm like, this was a terrible idea to get this in such a visible place on my forearm. There are a lot of different ways of describing the novel. Let me say at its most general that it's a story about the impossibility of telling or owning your own life story. Let me explain what I mean. The novel is divided into 9 separate volumes that were published serially between 1759 and 1764, usually 2 at a time. The first 2 volumes, when they were released, were an immediate smash hit, and the sort of ebullience of the public reception of the novel is really hard to overstate. It's an early example of sentimental fiction in the so-called Age of Sentiment. But more than that, it is an exercise, a masterclass in literary comedy. If you take the time to read it with the attention it deserves, because it still is, after all, about 250 years old, you too, I think, will be laughing out loud more than once on every page. And so I have to say, as important as it is to read Sade, that's like taking your medicine. I think everybody should give themselves the opportunity to work through Tristram Shandy. Now, the story involves, the full title of the novel is The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. And there he sets out to tell his life story and what he thinks about things. And he finds out immediately that he can't begin to explain his absolutely singular and idiosyncratic opinions about anything, let alone the absolute idiosyncratic singularity, and I guess idiocratic singularity of his life, without telling the stories and explaining the opinions of all the people surrounding him who make up his little world, particularly his father, Walter, and his uncle, Toby. So most of these, private histories, as they used to be called, we might call them autobiographies or fictional autobiographies at this point, begin as Robinson Crusoe begins, for instance, with a phrase like, "I was born." Those are the first 3 words of Robinson Crusoe. Tristram Shandy begins on the night of his conception, or his apparent conception, since it turns out that his mother has a kind of Pavlovian response to his father's winding of the clock, something that he does once a month along with other conjugal responsibilities. So then he enters the bedroom to discharge this particular conjugal responsibility but his mother says something like, "Have you forgot to wind the clock?" which has all sorts of sexual innuendous connotations, implying, among other things, that she's not enjoying herself. And that results in a kind of what he calls a scattering of the animal spirits. So already on page 1, the time is out of joint. There is, sexual innuendo steeped on every page. It's kind of an exercise in narrative impossibility. How does this character come to exist if this is the scene of his conception? And how does he know about any of this stuff, right? So every bit of what he's telling of his life is just what he's heard from other people. And, the book begins on the date of his supposed conception and ends 9 years prior to his actual birth. So it is, first of all, an exercise in literary realism, a kind of obsessional exercise in a kind of Lacanian materialism and empiricism, an attempt at a hilarious send-up of an encyclopedic arrangement of knowledge. And the encyclopedists in the middle of the 18th century were really formative to that movement we now call the Enlightenment. And it's almost entirely a novel comprised of conversations between men, which is exactly why I see there in this study of the Unwritten Enlightenment a book which is in fact entirely about the feminine.
Really? So you have the conception in Lacan of the idea that there is a non-rapport at the origin of sexuality, of the sexual relation, and you see this as a sort of proof, again, anachronistically, but like this whole thesis of your book, that we can kind of read these psychoanalytic conceptions back through. How does that then work in this particular novel? And it does remind me a bit of Remembrance of Things Past, insofar as this Proustian effort seems comparable in a way, where you have this idea of the impossibility to capture totality, to capture either the totality of a particular moment in a day, which is very seemingly mundane, but Proust has a way to capture 360 degrees of it, and still it feels incomplete. And here you're talking about the comedic incompleteness of anyone's biography, and therefore there's something. So before you answer that question about the sexual non-rapport, and I invite you to explain that, can you explain a little bit more about the desire that the novel brings out in you? It's a comedic point, but it's also, there's something, is there an identification that you have with this process, or what is it exactly, out of curiosity? Could you say a little bit more about that, that feeling that it elicits in you? I'm trying to get a sense of it, and maybe this will be an inspiration for me to actually go out and read it.
Yeah. What a fabulous question. I haven't received this question before. I really appreciate it. And what it immediately calls to mind is the fabulous BBC 4 series from the aughts, Peep Show. Have you seen Peep Show?
No, but I've heard about it.
Yeah. Well, it's terrific. And like Peep Show, Tristram Shandy is a kind of reading Tristram Shandy feels like a masochistic exercise in encountering my own phallic pretentiousness and the preposterousness of it all. Sort of the way in which one wields one's intellect, one's language, one's words as an assertion of authority, and yet through every such assertion only appears more ridiculous. Every assertion of authority is at the same time an admission of a lack of authority. Every exercise of phallic power is in fact a disclosure of one's symbolic impotence. So there's something really embarrassing about being a man. And these days it's, people like to talk about it a lot. And there are a lot of, I think, dangerous and in many ways devastating charlatanesque offers at a cure for that embarrassment, the so-called manosphere, the doubling down on misogyny, violence against women in all its forms, which is nothing new. It is probably the groundwork of our entire civilization. Well, what something like Tristram Shandy or what Peep Show allows is an opportunity to enjoy the embarrassment, to not take oneself so seriously, revel in sexual frustration, to laugh at oneself without in doing so allowing oneself off the hook, right? It's not a kind of a cathartic laughter. It's a leaning into what is so ridiculous about masculinity as it's been constructed, conditioned, and as it's still practiced today.
Brilliant. So you've already bringing us to the precipice of this famous Lacanian idea of the impossible rapport. What, and it's good that you end, your text with this idea, but how does the text stage that, or sort of, ahead of its time by several hundred years?
Yeah. These two men who are constantly talking to one another have their own obsessions. And so while they're talking to each other, they're only talking really to themselves. So there is a conversation without communication, which is the totality of the text, more or less. And this is a kind of an example of the sexual non-rapport, the sexual non-relation, in that the other is never quite where you want them to be or who you want them to be, so that you are only ever, in a sense, making love, whether it's physically or verbally or in any other way, to an ideal and impossible object that, in fact, is only there to the extent that you fantasize its being, right? So you are kind of alone with this object in your fantasy. That's the first part. The second part is, and this remains within the domain of fantasy, in order for there to be a sexual relation, one would have to be able to somehow unite with that object, which is the object of the subject's desire. But such unity would spell the end of the conditions for the possibility of desire. And so the relationship would also mean the end of the difference between these two entities, and therefore the end of the possibility of a relationship. I'll repeat what I said a minute ago. There can be no relation without difference. A third way of putting it is to say, by way of the logic of sexuation, as Lacan describes it, that masculine and feminine are not two halves of a kind of dyadic totality. Femininity is not a complement to masculinity or vice versa. And the idea that the two form a kind of symmetry of any sort belongs entirely on the side of the masculine. That what we call the feminine is all of that in our speech, in our experience, in our reality, that cannot be, that will not be subordinated to the logic of sense that organizes the tyranny and the desire of a signifier. To put that in a different way, when I speak, I want to make sense. As soon as I make sense, I will have to stop speaking. So the condition for the enjoyment of my trying to make sense is that I fail ultimately ever to get there. And it's that failure ever to arrive at sense that masculinity protests against and enjoys simultaneously. And that, I think, is one way of understanding what Lacan means by the feminine. Now, obviously, this is a contentious point. It gets psychoanalysis into a lot of trouble. On the clinical side of things, there is a stubborn insistence on misreading sexual difference as a kind of biological essentialism, where I think nothing really could be further from the truth. Lacan is not interested in biology or in biologizing subjectivity. Otherwise, why even introduce the linguistic turn into psychoanalysis in the first place? So it is the desire to grab hold of, to finally contain, to control, and to use the feminine, which drives a masculine logic of desire, and which at the same time ensures that that desire will never be accomplished. The feminine is the kind of incurable otherness which animates and frustrates the urge to unite with and to make one's sense for all. So the impossibility of the sexual relation is profoundly generative and creative, even though it's frustrating and tormenting at the same time.
Beautiful. Now, slight side point just for my own clarification. The concept of the hobby horse is interesting to me here that you talk about. Can you explain that? And I believe this is something that originates from Tristram Shandy. As I understand it, it's kind of like this insight that the novel shows that something about our passions, or sort of the contingency of our obsessions or something like this. What is the didactic element here of what it instructs us about what the meaning of to be on our hobby horse? That's a phrase that we hear often. What does it signify here?
Yeah, hobby horse means a lot of different things before it gets to Tristram Shandy, but in a lot of ways sort of solidifies into the sense that you're beginning to define because of the novel. So I would suggest, without pretending to know you too well, Daniel, that this show is your hobby horse. You put a lot of time into it. You care a lot about it. It's not something that you can expect everybody to care about. And in fact, you're probably happiest when you're left alone to do your work as you enjoy doing it. Not just you wouldn't enjoy recognition, accolades, and so on, but that's not the principal reason why you do what you do the way you do it.
Yeah. Or put another way, it's Adorno has a famous saying that he says about how offended he is that someone would presume that his obsessions or his passions, or whatever you want to call them, are hobbies. And I've always resonated with Adorno's position there, because there's something cheap about that, because the hobby is presumed to be outside of like regimented capitalist division of labor. We do that separately, and it's like our own little special thing. But in fact, actually, there's a death drive to the hobby horse.
Yeah, the hobby horse.
I mean that in a positive sense, not as something, right? Whereby, no, you can't describe it, but it's everything to me, or something like that. So what does Tristram Shandy reveal about the truth of the hobby horse?
Right. Why do I commit myself to this passion, to this obsession, to this kind of endless, unsatisfying project? It's because,
well, it's both. It's not unset. That's the paradox, though, of jouissance. Is it always unsatisfying? Not necessarily.
Well, what do you mean by unsatisfying in that regard? Maybe we mean different.
Well, I mean, it's a kind of layers. It's layers of both ecstasy, but also, sure, a lot of unsatisfaction. But it's like this knot. It's a knot that contains a contradictory, not necessarily contradictory, but kind of overlapping feelings, emotions, and so on. But it's certainly a knot which cannot be relinquished or left. It's a knot that defines the subject, or so okay, very interesting. But please explain how the novel kind of, what is Tristram Shandy's hobby horse, out of curiosity?
Tristram Shandy's hobby horse is writing the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy.
Of course. Okay.
Which is why it not only does it never end, but it goes backwards finally.
I see.
The hobby horse of his father, Walter, is similarly writing his own encyclopedic understanding of all things great or small. And he's doing so for his son, so as to hopefully, as Rousseau with Emile, produce a perfect or a more perfect replica of himself. So he calls this project his Tristrapedia. And his uncle Walter's hobby horse is the endless study of the minutiae of military sieges, which he recreates over and over again in his kitchen garden.
And this is related to a motif, which is a very psychoanalytic motif you talk about, of the primal scene.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Because he was wounded. The uncle was wounded in a battle. So it would therefore make sense that in the repetition, there's a compulsive repetition to revisit that scene.
Yeah.
So therefore the hobby horse is bound up with a primal scene. Maybe. Or maybe that's too strong.
Yeah, I know. I like that. It's bound up certainly with the logic that the primal scene as a kind of narrative encapsulation is meant to articulate. In other words, a primal scene from the Freudian point of view is an example of what he calls construction, as we were describing earlier on. It's not naming what really happened, but a narrative organization of the logic of the present. So in Tristram Shandy, it's an endlessly meandering, complicating, in some ways unreadable text. But the great Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky once called it the most typical novel in all of world literature. And that got me thinking, what does he mean by that? What could he mean by that? What would it mean to really bring a rigorous formalism, the way Shklovsky describes it, to bear on this novel, to disentangle the plot from the storyline, and to see what the constituting elements of the plot are. And what I discovered there is that every major movement across this meandering and bizarre text begins with an event of emasculation, an event of loss or of castration. And so the whole novel is structured by this experience of an inarticulable loss, that all the ensuing articulation is meant to treat, to contain, to control, and to name, but that it ultimately always fails to name, because of what it's trying to name, as you say, is a not, is a nothing, is an absence. And so it's, however, precisely in its failure to arrive at its destination, in its constitutive inability to name what it's after, that all the enjoyment unfolds. And that's another way of describing jouissance.
Only a Lacanian could make that little pun or that little word, because I said not with a K-N-O-T, but you said not. Only a Lacanian could make that operation. Very nicely done there. Wow. So the book is The Unwritten Enlightenment. Everyone must read it. Hopefully it's reasonably priced, Nathan.
Yeah. I mean, you can also...
It's in paperback now.
In fact, I'll tell your entire audience that you can use, if you order it from Northwestern University Press instead of one of the other mail order sites, if you use the code NUP 2024, you should get a decent discount on the price as well.
Beautiful. Now, this has been wonderful. I mean, I guess an encore question is about where I began on the question of ideology. Can you, because you conclude with the conversation on ideology, what are you trying to achieve? It seems to me that you're trying to contribute something, a sort of claim to this wider psychoanalytic, debate about ideology. Would you mind kind of recapitulating your position apropos ideology here?
Yeah.
Because I have my own hobby horse, my own axe to grind with ideology. Like I have many thoughts on it, and most of them come from a very Marxist point of view. for you, what's your agenda? What do you want to say about ideology? And moreover, is what you discovered in this text about ideology something you're incorporating in your other work?
So, to answer that last question, absolutely yes. I conceive of all of the work that I do more or less as taking place at the intersections of psychoanalysis and ideology critique. So you mentioned the end of the world, or the question, as I'm describing it now, of ruination. The question there would be what remains of the subject or of subjectivity as understood by Freud and Lacan after the collapse of sort of civilizational model or an ideologically structured reality, which is to say reality as such. I'm doing a lot of work right now on the intersections of psychoanalysis and psychedelics, and again, asking whether and to what extent psychoanalysis can offer a necessary ethical corrective to this recent explosion of scientific, institutional, and venture capital interest in the commodification of altered states of consciousness. And here I'm doing something similar and far more, I think, hopefully more exhaustive. This is, to my mind, a kind of theoretical core text for this whole project. In short, I want to insist that psychoanalysis, as I said a moment ago, well, several moments ago now, psychoanalysis is not merely a subspecies of ideology critique. It is not just another way of explaining social and historical circumstances for which we already have sufficient mechanisms of explanation. Otherwise, psychoanalysis just becomes a kind of adjunct to Marxism. And there are good reasons why psychoanalysis can be an aid to Marxism, just as there are good reasons why Marxism can and should be, I think, very useful or important to psychoanalysis. But they have to be kept apart, I think, this for ethical and for political reasons, because otherwise there is nothing left of being human outside of its ideological entrapment. And this isn't just a kind of normative claim. It's not an instance of wishful thinking. Everything in psychoanalytic praxis, experience, theory, and ethics makes clear that we are more than the realities to which we have been reduced. That more than, or that excess, which is also a less than, a not enough, a not quite fitting in, that's the domain of what I call fantasy. Now, I think over the last 30 or so years, thanks to powerful and important contributions, especially from people like Slavoj Žižek, there's been a tendency, a broad tendency. I see it at academic conferences. I see it in magazine articles. I see it in memes and on internet videos. There's this vast tendency to collapse the two of them, to diagnose social and cultural formations with a psychoanalytic language. And that's something that I, to an extent engage with myself here. So I'm not saying that that's like something that should be completely disregarded, but to say that there is a cause to psychoanalysis in the double sense that it's what makes psychoanalysis possible, and it's what psychoanalysis stands for, what it struggles for, what it fights for. And that is the dimension of our humanity that exceeds its embeddedness within the confines of its social and historical situation, not in a transcendental sense, not some kind of spiritual excess, but the singularity of each of us as subjects that gives all of us an opportunity to contribute something to this world that does not already exist, rather than being pressed into service for its reproduction.
Beautiful. So this is close to the Lacoulabart's Nancy notion of the absolute, but inflected with your own attention to the psychoanalytic remainders of the human that are not subordinated to culture or society or other forms of ideological superstructure, etc. Well, you've opened up a whole number of questions, and I think it would be really great to have you come back on to discuss both ruination as well as psychedelics, especially the psychedelic question, insofar as I'm so befuddled as to how the kind of 60s, because it's so tied up to sort of the legacy of 68,
Mhm.
where this ultra commodification of consumptive subversion, that we've sort of lost touch with that form of radicalism and so
Mhm.
on. So the consequences of that are seemingly immense.
Mhm.
So great projects, excellent insights. Thank you for everything. How does so? I'll put a link to the book. And how might people discover your work otherwise?
You can look me up online. You can check out my faculty page at Barnard. I have a lot of my stuff, for better or for worse, available on academia.edu,
Okay,
or you can email me.
okay, and I guess the final point I would make is that you are working on a translation of Fethi Ben Slama, the Tunisian Lacanian scholar, in his work on the very interesting bridge between Islam and psychoanalysis. Can you say something briefly about that before we close?
Yeah, this is a translation that's been in the works for a long time, and I'm kind of wrestling with the publishers to get it finally out the door. But I've done this translation with a colleague of mine at the University of Georgia, Roland Vegshow, of two different books, Declaration of Insubmission and Suddenly Revolution, 2004 text, written to attempt to reclaim the name of Islam from a kind of virulent Islamism, and to invent or reinvent a kind of secular tradition of Islamic civilization, alongside Ben Slama's 2011 text written right in the middle of the so-called Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia,
Mm.
during which he returns to some of those reflections and attempts from a subjective, in a psychoanalytic sense, a subjective point of view, to articulate the ecstatic excitement and possibility of a revolution that seems to have come from nowhere, beyond all expectation and all hope. So reading revolution as an instance of the unconscious at work in the collective. This is what I think Ben Slama is doing in these two texts, which very much operate internally as companion texts to one another.
Fascinating, Nathan. And these texts are Arabic? Are they French? They're
They're in
French?
French.
They're in French, yeah. Okay. Well, the book is The Unwritten Enlightenment. The author is Nathan Gorelick. Thank you for everything. Thank you for your time. I've learned a lot, and I hope others have as well. Until next time, friends and comrades.
This has been great. Thanks so much.
Peace out.
Bye.